2003, 16-year-old Lionel Messi makes his official debut for FC Barcelona. Finding Nemo premieres in cinemas, and Michael Jordan plays his final NBA game. While one legend was retiring, another era was reaching its end, though we didn't know it at the time. We were at the end of the classic era of Thomas and Friends. Series 7 premiering in the UK on the 6th of October 2003 and premiering in the US on the 5th of September 2004. This is the story of Thomas and Friends, Season 7. During the production of Season 7, Hit Entertainment finally acquired Thomas and Friends. This meant that there were going to be a lot of changes to the show after Season 7. Britt Allcroft started focusing on other ventures outside of Thomas and Friends and left after this season. David Mitton, becoming increasingly frustrated with outside interference from the studio, also departed after this season, along with Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell as composers, as Hit Entertainment wanted a completely fresh look going forward. While Season 7 was released in its true guise in the UK, the US had a bit more of a bumpy ride when it came to Season 7. For whatever reason, Hit Entertainment decided to release Seasons 7 and 8 as one joint venture, which was why it wasn't out until 2004. They were also left in the lurch as Alec Baldwin decided not to continue on as narrator after Season 6. Initially, Michael Angelis' voiceover work was used to see if American audiences would gravitate to it, the same way that they did with Ringo Starr in Season 1. But something tells me that they maybe didn't enjoy his narrations as much, because Michael Brandon was then brought in to voice both Seasons 7 and 8 back to back. Brandon was working in the UK at the time and answered the call, and the rest, as they say, is history. While this may have been a finale season, they also introduced a lot of new characters, including Spencer, Emily, Fergus, Murdoch, and Arthur. My own thoughts on this season of Thomas and Friends usually differ from the consensus of the fandom. A lot of the fandom don't see this as a good season, and I can kind of understand why, because one of the major gripes is the excessive use of stock footage in this season. For those who maybe aren't aware, stock footage is footage from previous seasons that is integrated into a new season. So footage from seasons 1 to 5 were randomly placed in episodes, essentially to make up runtime. And that really does take you out of the experience of the episodes. I've mentioned that with when the narrow gauge engines went from their original guys in season 4 to what they became from season 5 onwards. So I can kind of understand why fans would be a little bit, let's just say, aggrieved at it. But overall, I think this is a pretty solid season. Season 6 for me is the worst season of the classic era. To use my very clunky boxing analogy again, Season 6 was the fighter trying to get back on its feet after a potential knockout blow. Season 7 is the second wind that you get after that and get back in the fight. And that's what this felt like to me. I'm pretty sure that a lot of the cast and crew of this season knew that the writing was on the wall and thought, if we're going to go out, let's go out with the best product that we can. While some episodes didn't hit the mark, for me, the majority of episodes were really solid. I've noticed I tend to waffle on in these intros, and they probably will be getting shorter when we get into the Hit era because everything just becomes very samey. But let's just dive in to my rankings of Season 7 of Thomas and Friends. These are all my own personal opinions. Your list will be different than mine, and it's the one thing that makes the Thomas fandom so unique. Let me know in the comments how you would rank Thomas and Friends Season 7. All I ask is that you be respectful, and above all, enjoy the video. Okay, let's dive in. Number 26, Percy Gets It Right. Written by Paul Larson, Percy is worried about a wobbly track and tries to warn Thomas, but he ignores Percy's advice and as a result gets stuck in a landslide. They just continue the downgrading of Percy in this, and it just gets more and more annoying for me. As I've said previously, Percy is my favourite character, and to see him just be downgraded to a baby that needs everything explained to him, I just don't like it. And I really don't like how everybody treats Percy in this episode, particularly Gordon and the Fat Controller. They treat Percy like such a dick in this. And what's worse is Percy just takes it. That's not a Percy trait. You look at Percy in season 5, he would not take half the crap that he was getting flung at him. It just feels like with this personality shift, he just can't stand up for himself anymore. Either that or he's just given up. And that's not how I see Percy. He is definitely not a quitter. I do like that he gets some sort of redemption at the end, but it just really annoyed me. A good ending doesn't make up for a bad episode. Number 25, The Grand Opening. Written by James Mason, a new line is about to open on the narrow gauge railway, but Scarlowe ends up running late for the announcement. He worries about running late again, but it ends up being worth it when the hats get in trouble riding in the hot air balloon. Another episode where it's primarily focused on the human characters. Do you know my thoughts on the human characters? Especially Lady Hat. Just whiny, complaining, Sir Topham Hatt is treated like a little bitch. And speaking of that, Scarlowe is so out of character here. I know a lot of fans think that he is extremely out of character in another episode that I'll touch on later, but this episode for me is the worst offender. I especially don't like the way the Fat Controller treats Scarlowe in this. Scarlowe is one of the oldest and most revered engines on the railway. You would think that the Fat Controller would cut him a little bit of slack if he was late, which I guarantee he probably wouldn't have been that often. And considering the amount of credit that he's got in the bank, the Fat Controller should definitely cut him some slack. But no, Scarlowe is just treated like an imbecile. A lot of the narrow gauge characters start getting this treatment, as we know later on. No one comes out of this episode looking good. Number 24, The Refreshment Ladies Tea Shop. Written by James Mason, Peter Sam is given a job of finding the perfect place for the Refreshment Ladies' new tea shop. I feel bad for James Mason because he's wrote quite a few of the narrow gauge episodes that I don't particularly like. It doesn't mean that I think that he's a bad writer. I don't think any writer does a bad job. I just think maybe they don't understand the characters as well, if they're just new to the job, and there's a little bit of inconsistencies. And in this episode, I definitely feel inconsistencies here. My boy Peter Sam, the narrow gauge engine, ain't gonna like this, but I'm just not a fan of this episode. But since I have so much respect for that YouTuber, I'll just sum it up in basic points. I think the set design and the scenery are the best that it's been for the narrow gauge engines in this season, but the story is boring, it's really bland, and I'm just not a fan of it. Number 23, Renace and the Roller Coaster. Written by James Mason, Renace is given a special of taking school children around the narrow gauge railway, but is worried that he isn't special enough for the job. He soon gets into trouble when he goes down a bumpy line. The one word that I can use to describe this episode, lazy. Everything feels so generic, bland. It's meant to be a runaway and like a roller coaster, yet it has about as much thrills as a teacup ride. I think that this is a real assassination of Renace's character. It's horrible to see him just look like this petty, jealous douche nozzle. And especially for one of the characters that I really respected in the Railway series and the Classic era, it just makes me feel so bad. One thing I did like is how they did that little switch from Rusty's happy face, and when Renace goes past him, it switched to his shocked face. Very good bit of camera trickery there. Aside for that, it's crap. Number 22, Harold and the Flying Horse. Written by Robert Kingsland, the vicar is organising a village fete during the summer, and Harold wishes he could join the fun. He gets his big chance when rescuing a cart horse named Pegasus from a ditch. I like that it's a Harold-centric story, I just wish the story was a bit better. It had me intrigued at the start, it's why it's went up in my rankings from my top 10 worst list episodes of season 7, because I got to appreciate Harold a little bit more, and his general plight. Everybody else is off having fun, but because his job is so important, he doesn't get to have any fun. He's constantly on standby for emergencies. And the scene of him at his airfield, where we see characters like Tiger Moth and Butch the Breakdown Crane in the background, you know me, I like my cameos. Just the story itself was dull. Number 21, The Runaway Elephant. Written by George Tarry. A brand new park is opening on the narrow gauge railway, and Duncan is asked to deliver an elephant statue. However, he forgets his brake van and ends up being gearless. I've mentioned previously that the thing I don't like about this is that Duncan is rewarded for his carelessness, because where the elephant lands, people seem to like where it is, and they all cheer him for being a dumbass. Only thing that made sense from it is that Duncan would be embarrassed by it, because he knows he screwed up, and it could feel like he's being mocked for being a screw up. But at least Duncan was in character. He's the main narrow gauge engine that I think is still treated with the same consistency from season 4 up until the present point. And the story itself is alright. Just once again, it's the ending that lets it down for me. Number 20, Edward's Brass Band. Written by Robin Charteris, Edward needs refitting when he was originally going to take the Sodor Brass Band to an evening summer concert, but gets his chance when the band suddenly gets stuck in the aftermath of a storm. You know I like my cameos, and it literally has the biggest cameo in Big Mickey. And I've grown to appreciate this episode a little bit more, especially with how they treat Edward in the following seasons. My God, you'll hear enough of that when we get to them. At least he feels in character in this episode. It makes sense for him to be taking a brass band. I know a lot of people have wondered how Edward knows that it's an alarm that the brass band is playing, but I think what they were trying to do was play SOS in Morse code. I think that's how Edward knew. I could be wrong. Let me know in the comments if I am, as long as it's respectful. But we get to see Edward still in his character. We get to see Bertie in a supporting role, and it's a good slice of life story. And I've warmed up to the brass band a bit more. Number 19, James and the Queen of Sodor. Written by Paul Larson, James is given a very important special of collecting the Queen of Sodor and taking it to the smelters. To his surprise, it turns out to be a leaky, old, slimy barge. I've mentioned previously how I think that this episode should have played out differently than what it did, because it doesn't feel like James gets a true comeuppance. The point of the trick that Gordon played was that James was going to get completely filthy taking the Queen of Sodor, because he thinks he's doing a very important job and help bring him back down a peg. But he avoids any ways of getting dirty until the very end when Percy has his whistle clogged and blows dust on him. An okay version of events, but I personally think we should have tried a different approach. I would have liked to have seen something like this. James goes to get the Queen of Sodor and does get completely filthy. Covered in sludge, covered in dust, covered in dirt, covered in everything. But once he's dropped the barge off at the smelters, he goes to the washdown quickly and gets cleaned, comes back to the sheds, and they can still have the ending that was originally in place, because he thinks he's gotten out of it, only to get dirty again anyway. I think it would have been a nice 1-2 punch, just to show you that James could still get his comeuppance, and would also be a good pride comes before a fall story. The way it's done is okay. It was just something that always nitpicked me about it. Number 18, Best Dressed Engine. Written by Polly Churchill. May Day comes to Sodor and a Best Decorated Engine contest is declared, but Gordon wants nothing to do with it, because he thinks decorations aren't dignified for an express engine. Okay, Gordon shouldn't have won Best Dressed Engine. Sorry, I don't agree with that ending for the story. I would have liked if, for example, the Fat Controller was going to judge Best Dressed Engine, thinks that Gordon has actually dressed up, thanks him for taking part, but awards someone like Murdoch the award. So they can all still make fun of Gordon, because it seems like he's a Best Dressed Engine, and he could be even more pissed about it all, because he's got dragged into it by happenstance. It just makes it seem like you're more sympathetic for Gordon rather than thinking that he is rather pompous, which I think was the point of the story. The point is that you still think Gordon's too big for his buffers. He needs to lighten up. And this has essentially dragged him into that without his choosing. Again, it's just more nitpicks with episodes. Ways that I think stories could have been slightly improved upon. Number 17, Bad Day at Castle Lock. Written by Jenny McDade. Donald and Douglas are given a special of taking a celebration train to Callan Castle, but get stuck near the lock and find a scary monster. Luckily, it turns out to be Harvey, who comes to their rescue. Yeah, I know, you guys are going to be really shocked. I put a twin-engine episode pretty low down on the list. It doesn't mean there aren't good points to it. I particularly like Harvey's voice work by Michael Angelis. It sounds so much more in character for the engine than his season 6 impression. That just didn't sound right to me. You look at Harvey and how he's designed, this season 7 voice for him suits a lot better than the season 6 voice. Some of the missed effects are really good. Donald and Douglas in a starring role, especially because I know how long it's going to be since we see these two again, is more than welcome. And it has some nice spooky elements to it, which I mentioned in my model era spooky episodes video. I just think compared to previous work with Donald and Douglas in it, it's just not their finest outing. Number 16, Toby and the Windmill. Written by David Mitten and Jan Page, one of Toby's favourite places is an old windmill, but after a storm damages it, he must find a way to fix it. Instant cred is that David Mitten is one of the story consultants for this episode, and it's one of the last ones that has him for a story writing credit. Toby, I do think, is slightly out of character at the start. I don't think he would be so distracted by a windmill as to cause the accident that he causes, but I know that it needs to happen to continue the events of the story, and the way that he resolves the issue of the windmill is very in character to Toby. It's very much a Henry's Forest style episode, but with Toby as the lead character instead, which is a nice tie-in considering Toby was a part of the main resolution of Henry's Forest, and now he has his own episode. Number 15, Not So Hasty Puddings. Written by Robin Charteris, Elizabeth is given a special of delivering puddings for the children of the mainland during the Christmas season. However, despite her reliability, she slips into a snowdrift and needs Thomas's help. Another great Thomas and Elizabeth episode. Their chemistry and their dynamic is really strong in this. I love seeing that Elizabeth does have a bit of a fall from grace. It's what people who weren't a fan of her in season 6 would have been longing for, and they finally get it. The fact that it is Thomas that has to help, along with Terence the Tractor, and the fact that it's the last classic era winter setting episode, it also gives you a nice warm feeling. It's good that they have a resolution to the Thomas and Elizabeth arc. The story itself is really strong, and I enjoy it. Number 14, What's the Matter with Henry? Written by George Tarry, Henry feels very ill, and he breaks down when he is sent to deliver some coal trucks to Brendam Docks. Luckily, Emily comes to rescue her new friend. I think this episode is why so many people ship Emily and Henry as a couple in this fandom. They just seem to gel well together. Emily, sweeter, more kind-hearted and caring. Henry, grumpy curmudgeon, but with a soft side. It would make sense that you would kind of pair them off together, and this episode backs that up. Thomas and Percy are right a-holes in this as well, I gotta say. They just think that Henry's kidding on to be ill. Do they not realise his backstory and his history and everything he's went through, that he could be the one that's most likely to fall ill again? And even then, I just wouldn't buy that Thomas and Percy would just think he's faking it and leave him to all his woes and all his troubles. I think it would have been interesting to have Bill and Ben in their roles instead. They still have that cheeky, prickish nature to them, and because they aren't around Henry as much, it would make more sense that they would maybe think a big strong engine like Henry is just acting not well, so they have to do more work. I think maybe swapping them out would have been a better idea. It does add in the Henry is ill trope once again, but it doesn't rehash old ground like they eventually do with Henry needing special coal again for some reason. Number 13, Fergus Breaks the Rules. Written by Jan Page, Fergus has to work with Diesel, who later tricks him into going to the smelters. After Fergus ends up breaking the rules for the very first time, Thomas is sent to search for his friend. There's a lot to like about this episode. The first thing I want to mention is Diesel. He seems more like his old self in this, scheming and plotting rather than just being an outright bully. That's the way I've always seen Diesel. That's the way I've always liked Diesel, where he has a bit of smarts and more intelligence to him. The smelters seems more intimidating in this episode than it did in season 6 by a country mile, and it would be understandable why Fergus would be so scared to be there. And I know that Fergus technically doesn't break the rules because, Diesel tricked him, but the point of it is, Fergus feels like he broke the rules for the very first time, after doing everything by the book and doing everything right, which is a bit of an annoying catchphrase, but not as bad as the infamous, "That's right." But it does establish Fergus as a good character with strong morals, and you can see why it would upset him so much that he does break the rules. And I like that the Fat Control doesn't send Diesel away, just establishes him at the smelters. So it finally knocks that trope on the head and makes you realise that Diesel is on Sodor, he's here to stay, and you just have to deal with it. And it also makes sense that he puts him at the smelters because that's where Ari and Bert, his brothers in arms, are based. Number 12, Something Fishy. Written by Paul Larson, Arthur hopes to work at the new branch line running the fishing village, but Thomas is unfortunately given the job. Luckily, Arthur gets his chance when Thomas is in an accident. The accident with Thomas is the same as the world's strongest engine accident with Diesel. He should land face down, but somehow lands face up. Don't get how that would have happened. But I love this episode because it establishes more of the character of Arthur. We find out that he likes the fishing village. That's where he wants to be, and that's what he wants to do. But he just doesn't have that confidence yet to stand up to the Fat Controller and say, that's my job, I want it. And it takes Thomas having this incident before he finally gets the courage to do so. And then it gives him a home base. Somewhere where he has a purpose, has a job, and is really useful. A solid story for a new character. Well done. Number 11. Trusty Rusty. Written by James Mason, Rusty notices that an old wooden bridge is in need of repairs, but Duncan ignores his warning and runs recklessly into a dangerous situation. The entire sequence with Duncan and Rusty on the bridge, really suspenseful, and I really enjoyed it. But Duncan's driver is a complete moron for just removing that closed sign and then carrying on. No wonder they start writing out drivers and firemen after this in the high era. But I do like that it keeps the Rusty and Duncan dynamic going. I know that it was resolved in season 4. This just feels like it's just a rehash of an old trend. But just because you resolve one issue with a colleague that you work with doesn't mean you aren't going to find any other ones that get on your tits. So I do understand that there could always be tension and rivalry with Duncan and Rusty. They just work so well together. So why wouldn't you try and mine more gold out of it? Number 10. 3 Cheers for Thomas. Written by Jan Page, Thomas goes back to racing with Bertie during the Children's Sports Day. Even though Bertie wins the race, Thomas receives his very own medal for being really helpful. 2 things that I like about this. 1, there's another race with Thomas and Bertie. And 2, that Bertie wins the race, and at the end of the classic era of Thomas and Friends, it's all square. Bertie finally gets his win back. A lot of people talk about how this episode really hammers home the growth of the character of Thomas from season 1 to season 7. And I do agree with that. You think about what he was like in season 1 when Thomas and Bertie had their race. He seemed very reckless and careless because he just wanted to win. This time, he puts others over himself and essentially forfeits the race so that he can be a help. That does show the maturity of his character. And the Bertie and Thomas dynamic is always good. Number 9. Snow Engine. Written by Jenny McDade, Oliver hates snow, but discovers how magical it is when he becomes a snow engine for the Sodor Winter Festival during the Christmas season. I think the reason this is so high up is because this is the last time that we see Oliver and Toad in any major capacity or any lead role for an extremely long time. The episode itself is good. The winter effects are good. Duck has a little bit of a cameo in this episode. It's the only thing that annoys me about season 7. He just seems to be reduced to cameo roles and extremely bit parts. It's like they knew they were planning on writing Duck off and prepared us for the inevitable. But the Oliver and Toad dynamic in this episode is once again very on point. I love how their perceptions of snow change throughout the course of the episode, with Oliver eventually enjoying snow and Toad eventually despising it. And the crash itself was really strong. Number 8. The Old Bridge. Written by Paul Larson, Skarloey crosses through an old and damaged bridge and has an accident. He's too scared to cross it again, but overcomes his fear when saving Rhaenys after he runs out of water. Keyboard warriors at the ready. There is so much hate for this episode. A lot of it I think is unjustified, because I do enjoy this episode. Do I think Skarloey is out of character in this? Actually, I don't. I think if you look at it in the context of the episode, he has every right to be scared. He has had a brush with death. And just because you're older doesn't mean that you are immune to the fear of death. If anything, you should be more scared of it as you get older, because it's coming a lot quicker. So it would be understandable that if he's had a near-death experience on this bridge, no matter if it's fixed, that he would be scared to go across it. You wouldn't want to go across it if something like that happened. But what was really good about the episode is that eventually, when push comes to shove, it's what you do in spite of fear that makes you heroic. That's what Skarloey does. Rhaenys is in trouble, and he goes and helps his friend. Even though he is absolutely terrified to cross that bridge, he still does it. And that's just proof that he really is a hero. Number 7. Spotless Record. Written by Paul Larson, a new tank engine named Arthur arrives on Sodor and is known for his spotless record. But it doesn't last long when Thomas plays a cheeky trick on him. That character growth I mentioned in 3 Tears for Thomas, completely shafted in this episode. Because Thomas is such a ball bag in this. I have mentioned this in my Thomas is a ball bag video, but this is such a major dick move by Thomas. He's essentially jealous because this new tank engine Arthur has got a spotless record, has never been in trouble, so he essentially sabotages the spotless record. What a prick. And the ending of it just never sat well with me. The whole, maybe records are meant to be broken and then mended again, like friendships. Birthday card pish. There should have been more of a repercussion for Thomas. If I were Arthur, I would be justifiably pissed at Thomas. I know that we're trying to establish Arthur as more of a gentle soul, a forgive and forget kind of character. It's what makes him so appealing. I do like the character of Arthur, and I think this is a good episode for him. It finally gets that little spotless record off his back, and in turn allows him to loosen up a little bit, which he does in Something Fishy. You know, it's just a massive dick move by Thomas in this. But it stands out in my mind, which means it's a good episode, and the story is strong. Number 6, Peace and Quiet. Written by Paul Larson, a mighty new engine called Murdoch longs for peace and quiet, but soon learns that he would much rather have Salty and Harvey as his new friends. I've went into this in a full video talking about this episode and the My Thomas Story Library book that came out afterwards, where I think there were some improvements that were made. So if you want a full in-depth analysis, go and check that out. But for anybody that doesn't, I'll give you the bullet points here. It's a solid episode, it's a great introduction to the character of Murdoch. I like his chemistry with Harvey and Salty, but there's one point in this episode that I think the storybook did better, and you can find that out by going to watch the video. Number 5, Gordon and Spencer. Written by Lee Pressman, a speedy mainland engine named Spencer visits Sodor with a Duke and Duchess. A party is to take place at Marin, but Spencer refuses to take on water, causing him to get stuck. Luckily, Gordon comes to his rescue. Who would have thought that this rivalry between Gordon and Spencer would last from season 7 to season 21? I think because they knew from this episode that they struck gold with this pairing. It is an engine who can realistically not only rival Gordon, but best Gordon. And he's based on the infamous Mallard engine of the same design, an engine which can royally kick Gordon's ass when it comes to speed in real life basis. I've talked about how in 3 Tears for Thomas, they mention a lot of Thomas's maturity and growth from that episode. Gordon and Spencer kinda does the same thing. It shows how Gordon has grown as a character over the 7 seasons, because Spencer is Gordon from season 1, a pompous, hotshot a-hole who ironically gets stuck on Gordon's hill, because he doesn't listen to anybody's advice. And in an ultimate karma moment, it's Gordon that helps Spencer on Gordon's hill. It finally closes that little book of Gordon's character, but it still lets you know there's still that little cheeky get in there, because there's a couple of mutters throughout this episode that still sum up the Gordon we know and love is still in there. Just a quality episode. Number 4, Bulgy rides again. Written by Brian Truman, Sodor is short on engines during the summer holidays, so Bulgy is brought back into service to show the holiday makers around the island. The conclusion to a Bulgy story arc that I didn't think that we would get. And in all honesty, if they left it here, I would have been fine with it. Closes the book on Bulgy, shows that he's changed, shows that he doesn't want the life that he used to crave, which was passengers and destroying the rails. His punishment has gave him time to reflect, become more humble, more grounded, but also realise that he doesn't want to be a hen house either. He's sick of them, and he's sick of passengers, because they just complain all the time. So it makes sense for him to become the vegetable bus. Doesn't need to worry about passengers, he can just live a peaceful life. Maybe why I gravitate to it so much. I'm getting to the stage where I just want a peaceful life. But this is the only point though, where I feel like cameos kind of bite it in the ass for me. In season 12, there is a cameo of Bulgy in his traditional red paint. When I recorded the season 12 video, I was over the moon that I saw this. And then I thought, they just undone all the hard work that they'd done in Bulgy Rides again for his redemption arc. Number 3, Salty's Stormy Tale. Written by Polly Churchill, A storm arrives at Brendam Dock and a lighthouse's lamp goes out close by. Luckily, Salty and Fergus have an idea that saves the day. This is a great Salty-centric story, as we get a bit more layers to his character. We realise that Salty is a little bit of a sensitive soul. You wouldn't think that a gruff dockyard diesel would be so upset by silly tank engine quote-unquote insults, but it really does get to him, and it drives home a good message of be careful on how you copy other accents because it could be seen as mocking them, which also made it good that it was Emily that told off Thomas and Percy. She has a Scottish accent, and it would make sense to come from her to say, don't copy how other people speak, because you can hurt their feelings. Once again, it does show the downgraded characters of Thomas and Percy, but when you flip it around as well, it does make sense for them to do it, because they're not mocking Salty. They were having fun because they like him, they like the way he speaks, and they want to copy him as a term of endearment. Great story, a good introduction to Fergus. It's very inventive to how they use his flywheel in this. And I like that once again they're using ships, stormy weather, lighthouses, all things that are related to sea that Salty would naturally jump at the chance to be a part of. Number 2, Bill, Ben and Fergus.
Written by Brian Truman.
A new railway traction engine named Fergus is given the job of working at the quarry, but he wants everyone to do things right, much to Bill and Ben's annoyance. What I really like about this episode is that all of the main players in it are kinda in the wrong. Fergus is being a control-hungry dictator because he's obsessed with doing everything right, doing everything by the book. Bill and Ben are of course wee ball bags because they cause all the chaos that happens because they're just constantly defying Fergus and trying to prove that he's old and out of touch, and they want to get him in a spin and it's not working. So it's this little storm that just brews and brews throughout the whole episode until eventually, and quite literally, all comes tumbling down on Fergus. And then they all realise that they share fault in this and try and make the situation right. It's a very good story, and it thoroughly deserves to be number 2 on this list. Now, the number 1 episode of Thomas and Friends Season 7 is Emily's New Coaches. Written by Jan Page, a new engine named Emily arrives on Sodor and takes Annie and Clarabelle by mistake. This makes Thomas upset, but he soon makes amends with Emily when she rescues him and Oliver from a terrible accident. This is one that I'm quite surprised that a lot of people don't like, but I think this is a strong introductory episode for Emily. I think it makes sense for her character at this point to bed her in. I know that they messed about with her character in the Hit era, and I have some interesting thoughts about that we will get to, but I think having her as kind of a blank slate in this episode does make sense. Now hear me out. The reason that I think it makes sense is because whenever anybody new arrives at any workplace, you don't know anything about them. You have to find out about their personality and their character traits the more you work with them. Because being a new person in a working environment, you do hold your cards close to your chest. Because you think, what if people don't like me? Can I actually be myself in this workplace environment without potentially getting fired? Emily essentially does what most new employees would do. Very polite, very civil, does her job, doesn't understand the way things are done on Sodor, because she takes Annie and Clarabelle's coaches not realising they're Thomas's, and in turn, everyone hates her for it. Even Edward, which I found weird at first. And then, when I thought about it, it did kind of make sense. I mean, all the engines are seeing this brand new engine with Thomas's coaches. They know they're Thomas's coaches, and they're rightly affronted by it. But I don't think Edward would outright ignore her. I think Edward should have been the one that told her, these are Thomas's coaches. Maybe there's been a bit of a miscommunication here. But I know they had to establish Oliver for later on in the episode for the inciting incident, which was really good and does establish the true personality of Emily. A lot of people might not agree with me that they think this is the best episode of season 7. That's fine. But for me, I think that this is. And that is my ranking video of Thomas and Friends season 7. Let me know in the comments what your rankings would be of season 7. And until next time, keep on chugging.